The hungry howl of winter wind rattled the empty plates on Jane Zimmerman's kitchen table, a sound that matched the hollow ache in her chest. 3 months, a widow, and still the silence of her small homestead cabin threatened to swallow her whole. At 24, Jane hadn't imagined she'd be alone in the harsh Kansas territory of 1876, with nothing but memories and mounting debts to keep her company. She stared at the bare wooden tabletop, fingers tracing the grain where William's plate should have been. The pneumonia had taken him quickly, leaving her with their struggling cattle ranch and no means to maintain it. Tomorrow the bank would come, and Jane had nothing to offer them but the same emptiness that filled her home. The unexpected knock at her door startled her so badly she knocked over the single oil lamp, barely catching it before it shattered. No one came calling this far out, especially not in the bitter January cold. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Perhaps it was Mr. Gaines from the bank, come early to take what little she had left. Gathering her faded calico skirt, Jane crossed to the door and pulled it open, bracing against the blast of frigid air. The man standing on her porch was a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered beneath a snow-dusted sheepskin coat. His face, partially hidden by a scarf, revealed eyes the color of summer sky. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thomas Graves. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I was hoping I might trouble you for shelter until morning." Jane hesitated, her hand tight on the door. A woman alone had reason to be cautious, but turning anyone away in this weather was a death sentence she couldn't bring herself to deliver. "You can stay in the barn," she said finally. The man, Thomas, glanced toward the small structure behind her cabin. "Much obliged." He shifted, revealing a pack horse behind him laden with supplies. "I've got some provisions I'd be happy to share in exchange for your kindness." Jane almost refused out of pride, but her stomach twisted painfully, reminding her that she'd stretched her last bit of flour into a meager biscuit that morning. That would be acceptable. Within half an hour, Thomas Graves had stabled his horses, brushing snow from his coat as he carried a canvas sack into her kitchen. Jane watched in stunned silence as he unpacked salt pork, dried apples, coffee beans, cornmeal, and even a small sack of sugar luxuries she hadn't seen in months. "I can't accept all this," she protested. Thomas's weathered hands paused over the items. "Just a fair trade for shelter, madam, nothing more." He glanced around the sparse cabin, his eyes lingering on the empty pegs where William's coat and hat once hung. Understanding softened his features, but he asked no questions. Instead, he set about building up her dying fire, then gestured toward the food. "Might I prepare us something? Been riding since dawn with nothing but jerky." Jane nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with this stranger moving so confidently in what had been her domain. But as the aroma of frying salt pork filled the cabin, her resolve weakened. When Thomas set a heaping plate before her, the sight of real food brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, not just for the meal, but for filling the oppressive silence that had been her only companion for too long. Thomas took the chair opposite her, William's chair, and bowed his head briefly before picking up his fork. They ate without speaking, but the silence had transformed from something empty to something shared. Jane couldn't know that this snowstorm, this chance encounter, would be the first of many meals they would share at her kitchen table. She couldn't know that Thomas Graves, with his quiet strength and steady presence, would slowly help her rebuild more than just her ranch. As she watched him across the table, she felt something stir within her, not love, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin, hope. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jane woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in her yard. Through frosted windows, she watched Thomas checking his horses, his breath clouding in the winter air. He'd slept in the barn as promised, leaving her home undisturbed. Hastily dressing, Jane stepped outside, hugging her thin shawl around her shoulders. "You're leaving?" Thomas turned, adjusting the cinch on his saddle. "Thought I'd ride into town, get my horse reshod." He paused, studying her face. "Unless you've need of anything there." Jane thought of Mr. Gaines, of the bank note due today. "I have business in town myself." "Then I'll wait," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to delay his journey for a woman he barely knew. The ride to Cottonwood Springs was 7 miles of uncomfortable silence. Jane perched side-saddle on her aging mare, wondering what Thomas made of her shabby clothes and the obvious poverty of her situation. He asked no questions, offered no small talk, just kept his horse at an easy pace beside hers. Main Street was busy for a winter morning. Farmers in heavy coats clustered outside the general store, while a group of cowboys fresh off a cattle drive spilled from the saloon despite the early hour. Jane felt eyes following her. The young widow was an object of both pity and speculation in town. "I'll see to my horse," Thomas said as they reined in front of the blacksmith's. "Where shall I find you after?" "The bank," Jane replied, her throat tight. "I won't be long." Inside the Cottonwood Springs Bank and Trust, Mr. Gaines sat behind a polished desk, his spectacles glinting in the light from the window. His face showed neither surprise nor pleasure at Jane's appearance. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I expected you yesterday." "The weather delayed me," Jane said, clutching her reticule where she'd placed the last of her egg money nowhere near enough to cover the payment due. "I'm afraid sentiment cannot factor into business decisions," Mr. Gaines said after she'd explained her situation. "The bank has been more than patient. Without today's payment in full, foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately." Jane fought to keep her voice steady. "If I could have just one more month, is there a problem here?" Jane turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. Something in his stance made Mr. Gaines straighten in his chair. "This is a private matter, sir," the banker said. Thomas stepped fully into the office. "Mrs. Zimmerman was kind enough to offer me shelter during yesterday's storm. I consider it my duty to ensure she's treated fairly in return." Jane opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas continued, addressing her directly. "I'm looking for grazing land to establish a new herd. Would you consider taking on a partner in your ranch operations, Mrs. Zimmerman?" Before she could respond, he turned back to Mr. Gaines. "How much is the payment due today?" The figure the banker named made Jane wince, but Thomas simply reached inside his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. He counted out bills and placed them on the desk. "That should cover this month's payment with interest," he said calmly. "Mrs. Zimmerman and I will discuss arrangements for future payments once we've formalized our business partnership." Jane stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. This stranger, this man she'd known for less than a day, was intervening in her most private troubles, offering solutions she hadn't even considered. Outside the bank, she found her voice. "Mr. Graves, I cannot accept your money or your proposition. We are not acquainted and I have no reason to trust your intentions." Thomas adjusted his hat, squinting against the winter sun. "You need help, Mrs. Zimmerman. I need grazing land. It's a practical arrangement, nothing more." His expression softened slightly. "I've been drifting since the war ended, looking for somewhere to put down roots. Your land looked promising, even under snow. And if I refuse, then I'll wish you good day and be on my way," he said. "But first, I'd like to buy you dinner at the hotel." "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in some time." Jane should have been offended by his bluntness, but exhaustion and hunger overrode her pride. "One meal," she conceded. "And then we'll discuss this proposition of yours properly." The hotel dining room was warm and fragrant with cooking smells that made Jane's stomach twist with longing. She ordered the least expensive item on the menu, but Thomas insisted on adding soup, bread, and apple pie. As she ate, he outlined his proposal. He would invest in restocking her ranch, provide labor and expertise, and they would split the profits once the operation was solvent again. "Why would you do this?" Jane asked finally. "There's better land available, land without complications." Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I've been riding from place to place for 11 years, Mrs. Zimmerman. Fought in the war, then worked cattle drives, mining camps, whatever paid, saved every penny." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm 36 years old. Too old to keep drifting, too young to give up on building something that lasts." There was something in his steady gaze that Jane recognized, a loneliness that mirrored her own. Not pity as she'd feared, but understanding. "I'll need to think about it," she said. Thomas nodded. "Of course. I've taken a room here for tonight. I'll call on you tomorrow to hear your decision." That night, alone in her cold cabin, Jane weighed her options. Without help, she would lose the ranch within weeks. William's dream, their dream would die, and she would be left with nothing. Thomas Graves was a stranger, but something in his manner inspired trust. His proposal was reasonable, advantageous even, with no suggestion of anything beyond a business arrangement. When he arrived the next morning, she was waiting on the porch, her decision made. "1 year," she said without preamble. "We'll try this partnership for 1 year, but this remains my home and I have final say in all matters concerning it." Thomas dismounted, his expression giving away nothing. "Agreed, I'll sleep in the bunkhouse." "There is no bunkhouse," Jane admitted. "Just the barn." For the first time, Thomas smiled, a slight upturn of his lips that transformed his weathered face. "Then I'll build one. That'll be my first contribution to our partnership." Over the next weeks, Jane learned that Thomas Graves was a man of few words but considerable action. He rode to the neighboring town of Hillsborough and returned with a wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. Each morning he rose before dawn, worked on the small bunkhouse until breakfast, then turned his attention to the neglected fences and outbuildings of the ranch. Jane found herself rising earlier too, making sure a hot breakfast awaited him. It was strange having a man's presence on the property again, strange to hear the sound of hammering and sawing after months of silence. Strangest of all was adjusting to Thomas's quiet competence, so different from William's enthusiastic but often misguided efforts. "Your husband built this place?" Thomas asked one evening as they shared a supper of rabbits to his contribution from hunting that afternoon. Jane nodded. "We came out from Pennsylvania right after we married. William had big dreams about cattle ranching, though he'd never seen a cow up close before we arrived." The memory brought a sad smile to her face. "He learned as he went, made plenty of mistakes, but he never gave up." Thomas was silent for a moment. "That takes courage, starting something you don't know how to finish." "Yes," Jane agreed, studying him across the table. "It does." February turned to March, and with the first hints of spring came new activity. Thomas rode to the cattle auction in Wichita and returned leading 20 head of cattle, the start of their new herd. Jane watched from the porch as he guided them into the pasture, his movements confident and sure. "Herefords," he explained later. "Hardy stock, good for this climate. We'll build slowly, focus on quality breeding." "William always wanted to try Herefords," Jane said softly, "but we could never afford them." Thomas glanced at her, then away. "Your husband had good instincts." It was the closest he'd come to personal conversation in their weeks together. Jane found herself wanting to know more about this taciturn man who had appeared in her life like an answer to an unspoken prayer. "Where did you learn about cattle?" she asked. Thomas focused on his plate. "My father raised them in Missouri before the war. Then I worked the drives from Texas up to Kansas for several years." "And your family, are they still in Missouri?" A shadow crossed his face. "No family left. Farm was burned in the fighting." "I'm sorry," Jane said, understanding now why he never spoke of going home. Thomas shrugged. "It was a long time ago." But Jane recognized the look in his eyes, the same one she saw in her own mirror when memories of William surfaced unexpectedly. Loss left marks that time could fade but never erase completely. As March progressed, bringing mud and the first green shoots in the pastures, Jane found herself watching Thomas more often. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the gentle way he handled the skittish heifers, the rare moments when something almost like a smile would touch his lips at some small success. One morning, Jane stepped out with a cup of coffee to find Thomas stripped to his waist, chopping wood in the early spring sunshine. She froze, the steam from the cup rising unnoticed as she observed the play of muscles across his back and shoulders. Heat rose to her cheeks, accompanied by an unfamiliar flutter in her stomach and a sharp stab of guilt. William had been gone only 5 months. What kind of widow noticed another man's body while her husband's grave was still fresh? Thomas turned, catching sight of her. For a moment, something passed between them, an awareness that transcended their careful, polite interactions. Then Jane thrust the coffee cup forward like a shield. "I thought you might be thirsty," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "Thank you," Thomas replied, reaching for his shirt and pulling it on before accepting the cup. If he noticed her discomfort, he gave no sign. That night, Jane lay awake long after the light in the newly completed bunkhouse went dark. She stared at the ceiling, trying to sort through her conflicted feelings. Thomas Graves was nothing like William, where her husband had been talkative and impulsive. Thomas was reserved and methodical. William had courted her with poetry and flowers. Thomas spoke to her of cattle breeds and fencing techniques. Yet, there was something compelling about Thomas's steady presence, about knowing he would be there each morning, dependable as the sunrise. In just weeks, he had transformed her failing ranch into a functioning operation again. More than that, he had brought purpose back to days that had stretched emptily before him. Was it wrong to feel this stirring of interest, to wonder about the man behind that guarded exterior? Jane pulled her quilt tighter around her shoulders, seeking answers in the darkness. April brought gentle rains and new routines. Jane found herself taking more care with her appearance each morning, pinching color into her pale cheeks before stepping outside to call Thomas for breakfast. He never failed to remove his hat upon entering, to thank her for each meal, to treat her with a courtesy that somehow never felt condescending. They settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet meals. Jane tended her vegetable garden and chickens while Thomas focused on the cattle and repairs. In the evenings, they would sometimes sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. Rarely did they speak during these times, but the silence between them had grown comfortable, almost companionable. Then came the evening that changed everything. Jane was returning from collecting eggs when she heard an unfamiliar sound. Thomas, laughing. She rounded the corner of the barn to find him kneeling beside a newborn calf, its mother hovering protectively nearby. "First of many," he said when he spotted her, his face transformed by a genuine smile. "Come see." Jane approached cautiously, crouching beside him. The calf was trying to stand on wobbling legs, falling and trying again with stubborn determination. "She's beautiful," Jane murmured. Thomas corrected gently. "And he'll be the foundation of our herd someday, our herd." The words settled warm in Jane's chest. She looked up to find Thomas watching her, his blue eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For everything you've done here, I would have lost it all without you." Thomas's gaze held hers. "You've given me something too, Jane. A place to belong again." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. The calf finally found its footing, taking unsteady steps toward its mother. Jane and Thomas rose together, standing closer than was strictly proper. For a breathless moment, Jane thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he stepped back, touching the brim of his hat. "I should check the other pasture before dark," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Jane nodded, gathering her basket of eggs. "Supper will be ready soon." But as she walked back to the cabin, her heart was beating too fast, her thoughts tumbling over themselves. Something had shifted between them, something both promising and frightening. The next morning, Thomas was gone before dawn. Jane found a note on the kitchen table, the first written communication between them since his arrival. "Gone to Wichita for supplies and to arrange cattle sale. Back in 3 days. TG." Jane read the brief message multiple times, tracing the firm, neat handwriting with her fingertip. 3 days without Thomas's presence seemed suddenly daunting. She'd grown accustomed to his footsteps outside, to the sound of his voice calling a greeting each morning. Without him, the homestead felt eerily similar to the lonely months after William's death, but she was not the same woman now. Jane straightened her shoulders and set about her chores with determination. Thomas had business to conduct, and she had a ranch to maintain in his absence. Their partnership required her strength, not dependence. By the 3rd day, however, Jane found herself watching the road anxiously. When a cloud of dust finally appeared on the horizon, she had to stop herself from running to meet the approaching wagon. Instead, she smoothed her best dress put on that morning for no reason she would admit and waited on the porch. Thomas looked different somehow as he guided the team into the yard. He'd shaved his beard, leaving only a neat mustache, and wore a new shirt under his familiar sheepskin coat. The wagon bed was piled high with crates and sacks. "Successful trip," Jane called, trying to sound casual. Thomas nodded, jumping down from the wagon seat. "Very, got good prices for the yearlings we discussed selling, and—" He hesitated, reaching into his coat pocket. "I brought you something." He extended his hand, revealing a small package wrapped in brown paper. Jane accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "You didn't need to bring me anything," she said, even as curiosity made her carefully unwrap the gift. Inside was a small book of poetry, Tennyson, one of William's favorites. Jane's throat tightened as she ran her fingers over the embossed cover. "The bookseller said ladies enjoy poetry," Thomas explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "If it's not to your taste, it's perfect," Jane interrupted, looking up with shining eyes. "Truly, thank you." Relief softened his features. "There's more in the wagon. Seed for the garden, some fabric the shopkeeper's wife recommended, coffee, sugar, and a surprise I'll need to show you." The surprise turned out to be a milk cow purchased from a farmer outside Wichita. "She's gentle," Thomas said as he led the placid Jersey to the barn, "and she'll give more milk than you can use. I thought perhaps you might want to make cheese to sell in town." Jane stroked the cow's velvety nose, touched by Thomas's thoughtfulness. He hadn't just brought her a gift, he'd brought her an opportunity for her own contribution to their growing enterprise. "I used to help my mother make cheese when I was a girl," she admitted. "I've always wanted to try it myself." Thomas nodded, as if he'd somehow known this about her. "Then it's settled." That evening, as they unloaded the wagon together, Jane felt a new ease between them. Thomas spoke more than usual, telling her about his negotiations in Wichita, asking her opinion on his plans for the coming months. When their hands accidentally met reaching for the same sack of flour, neither pulled away immediately. Later, after supper, Thomas lingered at the table rather than retreating to his bunkhouse as usual. Jane poured them both coffee, then, on impulse, opened the poetry book he'd given her. "Would you mind if I read aloud?" she asked. "William and I used to take turns reading in the evenings." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, not jealousy, but perhaps understanding. "I'd like that," he said quietly. Jane chose Ulysses, her voice growing stronger as she read the familiar lines. "I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. I am a part of all that I have met." When she finished, Thomas was watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "You read beautifully," he said. "William loved poetry," Jane explained. "He said it helped him make sense of things too big for ordinary words." Thomas nodded slowly. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Jane agreed. Then, gathering her courage, "Tell me about you, Thomas. In all these months, I've learned so little." He looked down at his coffee cup, silent for so long Jane thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "I grew up on a small farm near Springfield, had 3 younger sisters. Pa raised cattle, taught me everything I know about ranching." He paused. "When the war came, I joined up with the Union. Wasn't much choice in our part of Missouri." Jane listened intently, watching emotions cross his usually guarded face. "When I came home in '65, there was nothing left. Farm burned, family gone to relatives in Illinois." His knuckles whitened around the cup. "I couldn't stay there with the memories, so I headed west. Worked cattle drives, did some mining in Colorado, ranch work in Texas. Never stayed anywhere long." "Until now," Jane said softly. Thomas met her gaze. "Until now." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Thomas cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late." "Thank you for the reading." Jane walked him to the door, painfully aware of his height and breadth in the small cabin. "Good night, Thomas." He paused in the doorway, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Good night, Jane." As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Jane's garden produced bountifully, and her first attempts at cheese making proved successful enough that the general store in Cottonwood Springs agreed to sell her products. The cattle herd grew with several more births, and Thomas's careful management had turned the once failing operation into a promising enterprise. More importantly, the tentative friendship between Jane and Thomas deepened. Their evening conversations became a cherished ritual, with Jane reading from her growing collection of books while Thomas listened attentively. Occasionally, he would share stories from his travels, tales of stampedes and blizzards, of characters he'd met on the cattle trails. Jane found herself laughing more than she had in years. On a sweltering July afternoon, Thomas suggested they ride to the creek that marked the northern boundary of the property. To check the water level for the cattle, he explained, though Jane suspected he was offering an escape from the oppressive heat of the cabin. The creek ran cool and clear, shaded by cottonwoods that rustled in the slight breeze. Jane dismounted eagerly, removing her bonnet to feel the air on her face. "It's beautiful here," she said, watching minnows dart in the shallows. "William and I used to picnic by this spot sometimes." Thomas nodded, loosening his horse's cinch. "Your husband chose well when he picked this land." "Good water, good grass." Jane smiled at the practical assessment. "He chose it because of these trees, said they reminded him of the ones we courted under back in Pennsylvania." To her surprise, Thomas didn't stiffen at this mention of her past, as he sometimes did. Instead, he glanced at her with curiosity. "How did you meet?" Jane settled on a sun-warmed rock, smoothing her skirts. "At a church social. William recited poetry to impress the ladies, and I was the only one who recognized the verses." The memory made her smile. "He courted me for 6 months before proposing. My parents thought I was mad to accept William had nothing but dreams and a way with words." "But you saw something more in him," Thomas observed, sitting nearby. "I saw possibility," Jane admitted. "And I was young enough to believe that love could overcome any obstacle." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Were you right?" Jane considered the question carefully. "Yes and no. Love couldn't save our crops from drought or protect William from illness. But it made the good times sweeter and the hard times bearable." She looked up at him. "Have you ever been in love, Thomas?" He stared at the flowing water. "Once. Before the war, her name was Rebecca." Jane waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I asked her to wait for me," he continued. "She promised she would, but when I came back..." He shrugged, the gesture failing to hide the old pain. "She'd married a man who hadn't gone to fight. Can't blame her, really. 4 years is a long time to wait on a promise." "I'm sorry," Jane said softly. Thomas shook his head. "It was for the best. I wasn't the same man who left. War changes you." Jane studied his profile, seeing beyond the strength to the scars that weren't visible. Impulsively, she reached out, placing her hand over his. Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. Something passed between them, a current of understanding and shared solitude. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Jane's breath caught in her throat. The simple gesture felt more intimate than anything she'd experienced since William's death. Part of her wanted to flee from the intensity of it. Another part wanted to move closer, to discover what might happen if she allowed herself to truly feel again. Before she could decide, the distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Thomas released her hand, glancing at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming. We should head back." The ride home was silent, charged with awareness. Jane struggled to make sense of her emotions, guilt and longing tangled together in a confusing knot. Thomas had become essential to her life, not just as a business partner, but as a friend, perhaps something more. Yet admitting that felt like a betrayal of William's memory. They reached the ranch just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Thomas helped Jane dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met in the strange golden light that precedes a summer storm. "Jane," he began, his voice rough with emotion. But a crack of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. The horses shied nervously, breaking the moment. "We need to get them stabled," Thomas said, practical concerns overtaking whatever he'd been about to confess. By the time the animals were safely settled, rain was falling in blinding sheets. Thomas and Jane made a dash for the cabin, arriving breathless and soaked. "You're drenched," Jane observed, reaching for a towel. Without thinking, she began to dry Thomas's face, the domestic gesture feeling both foreign and natural. Thomas stood perfectly still under her ministrations, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When she lowered the towel, he caught her hand. "I should go to the bunkhouse," he said, though he made no move to leave. "You'll catch your death in this downpour," Jane replied. "Stay, please." The rain drummed on the roof, filling the silence between them with its steady rhythm. Jane was acutely aware of Thomas's presence, the scent of rain on his skin, the rise and fall of his chest, the warmth radiating from him despite his wet clothes. "I don't want to presume," he said finally, "or dishonor your husband's memory." Jane looked up at him, seeing the conflict in his eyes that mirrored her own. "William would have wanted me to be happy," she said softly, "to live, not just survive." Thomas's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she might shatter. "And would I make you happy, Jane?" Instead of answering with words, Jane rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Then Thomas's arms encircled her, drawing her against him as the kiss deepened into something hungry and needful. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Jane rested her forehead against his chest. "Yes," she whispered, "I believe you would." That night, Thomas slept on a pallet by the hearth, respecting the boundaries that still existed between them despite their newfound understanding. But something fundamental had changed. As Jane drifted to sleep, she realized the empty spaces in her home and heart were filling again, not replacing what she had lost, but creating something new alongside the memories. The following weeks brought a delicate courtship, unlike any Jane had experienced. Thomas brought her wildflowers gathered from the prairie, carved a delicate wooden comb for her hair, and listened with genuine interest as she shared her hopes for expanding the cheese-making operation. In the evenings, they would sit close together on the porch swing he'd built, sometimes talking, sometimes simply watching the sunset in companionable silence. Physical affection came gradually, a touch of hands while working side by side, a kiss goodbye when Thomas rode to town on business, an embrace that lingered longer each time. Jane found herself relearning the language of intimacy, discovering that her body remembered how to respond even as her heart navigated unfamiliar territory. By August, the ranch was thriving beyond Jane's most optimistic expectations. The banknote had been paid in full, with Thomas insisting that Jane keep the property solely in her name. "I didn't come here looking for ownership," he explained, "just partnership." It was this generosity, this utter lack of self-interest, that finally dissolved Jane's last reservations. One evening, as they walked the property at sunset, checking fences and admiring the healthy cattle grazing in the distance, Jane stopped beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Thomas," she said, gathering her courage, "I need to ask you something." He turned to her, his expression open and attentive. "Anything? When you proposed our partnership, you said it would be for 1 year. Jane twisted her hands in her skirt. "That year is nearly half over. What happens when it ends?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "What would you like to happen, Jane? I don't want you to leave," she admitted. "Ever." Something like joy transformed his usually solemn face. "Are you proposing to me, Mrs. Zimmerman?" Jane laughed, the sound startling a nearby meadowlark into flight. "Perhaps I am, Mr. Graves." "Would that be so terrible?" In answer, Thomas drew her into his arms. "I've been carrying something for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he murmured against her hair. Stepping back, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "It's not fancy," he apologized. "But I had it made in Wichita from gold I panned in Colorado years ago." Jane stared at the ring, then up at Thomas's face. "You've been planning to ask me, since the day by the creek," he confessed. "Maybe even before that, but I wanted to be sure you were ready." He took her hand gently. "Jane Zimmerman, I came here looking for land and found a home instead. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Jane's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then sealed their promise with a kiss that held all the passion they'd been restraining for months. When they finally broke apart, the prairie had fallen into twilight around them, fireflies beginning their nightly dance among the grasses. "We should head back," Thomas said, though he made no move to release her. Jane nodded, her head still spinning with happiness. As they walked hand in hand toward the warm lights of the cabin, she felt William's presence not as a shadow over her joy, but as a blessing. He had taught her how to love. Now she would build a new life with Thomas, carrying the best of her past forward into her future. They were married in September, when the prairie grasses turned golden and the harvest moon hung full and bright in the sky. The ceremony was small, just the preacher from Cottonwood Springs, a few neighbors, and the storekeeper and his wife who had become friends. Jane wore a new dress of blue calico that matched Thomas's eyes, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. The celebration afterward was held in their yard, with tables laden with food contributed by neighboring farms. There was music from a fiddle player who lived down the valley, and dancing that continued until the stars came out in force. As evening fell, Jane found herself standing slightly apart, watching Thomas talking animatedly with their guests, more talkative than she'd ever seen him. Joy had transformed him, softening the hard edges left by war and wandering. He caught her gaze across the yard and excused himself, coming to stand beside her. "Happy Mrs. Graves?" he asked, his arm slipping around her waist. The new name sent a thrill through Jane. "Very," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm beginning to think our guests might never leave." Thomas chuckled, a sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. Would it be terribly rude if they did? The heat in his eyes made Jane blush like a girl, despite the months of growing closeness between them. "Perhaps we could start saying our goodbyes," she suggested. It was another hour before the last wagon pulled away, leaving Jane and Thomas standing alone in the yard, bright with lantern light. Without a word, Thomas swept her into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their cabin, their home now, truly shared. Inside, everything was familiar yet transformed by their new status. Jane had spent the previous days preparing for this night, arranging wildflowers in jars, putting fresh linens on the bed, baking Thomas's favorite apple pie. Now, as he set her gently on her feet, all her careful preparations seemed inadequate. "I'm nervous," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Thomas took her hands in his. "We don't need to rush anything, Jane. We have all the time in the world." But Jane shook her head, squeezing his fingers. "I want this, want you. It's just been so long, and with William it was different." "I'm not William," Thomas said gently. "And I don't expect you to forget him or what you shared. He'll always be part of you, Jane, and that's as it should be." Tears sprang to Jane's eyes at his understanding. "How did I find you, Thomas Graves?" he smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "As I recall, I was the one who found you. Best wrong turn I ever took." Jane laughed, the tension breaking. Rising on tiptoe, she kissed him with all the love that had grown in her heart over the months of their partnership. Thomas responded with equal fervor, his hands spanning her waist, drawing her closer. Later, as moonlight streamed through the cabin windows and they lay entwined in the quiet aftermath of passion, Jane traced the scars on Thomas's chest, battle wounds he'd never mentioned. "Tell me about them someday," she murmured, pressing her lips to a particularly jagged mark near his shoulder. "Someday," Thomas agreed, his fingers tangling in her unbound hair. "But not tonight. Tonight is for beginning, not remembering." Jane smiled against his skin, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "I never thought I'd have this again," she confessed. "After William died, I was so certain that part of my life was over." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "I felt the same after Rebecca, convinced myself I was meant to be alone." His voice rumbled in his chest. "Then I saw you sitting at that empty table, looking like you were carrying the weight of the world, and something in me just shifted." Jane raised her head to look at him. "Is that why you shared your provisions that first night?" "Pity, not pity," Thomas corrected. "Recognition. I knew that emptiness." His hand cupped her cheek, "and I wanted to fill it somehow." "You have," Jane whispered, leaning into his touch, "more than I ever thought possible." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the boundaries between them dissolved by love and trust, built over months of working side by side. Jane's last thought before drifting off was how differently her life had turned out than she'd expected when she sat alone at her empty table that winter night, waiting for the bank to take everything she had left. The year that followed their marriage brought changes both expected and surprising. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Thomas's knowledge of cattle breeding improving their herd and Jane's cheese finding a devoted customer base as far away as Wichita. They added rooms to the cabin, transforming it into a proper home with a larger kitchen for Jane's expanding business, and a study where Thomas kept meticulous records of the ranch operations. In April, exactly 1 year after Thomas had brought home the milk cow that started Jane's cheese-making enterprise, she shared news that brought tears to his eyes for the first time in her memory. "A baby," he repeated, his voice choked with emotion as he placed a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. "You're certain?" Jane nodded, covering his hand with her own. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. He says everything looks healthy." Thomas gathered her into a careful embrace, as if she had suddenly become fragile. "I never thought I'd be a father," he confessed against her hair. "Are you pleased?" Jane asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," Thomas said, drawing back to look at her with eyes suspiciously bright. "Terrified, overwhelmed, grateful, all of those together," Jane laughed, recognizing her own jumbled emotions in his words. "I feel the same." "It's been so long since I allowed myself to hope for this." Thomas's expression grew serious. "You and William, did you try for children?" Jane nodded, appreciating his directness. They had long since learned to speak openly about her first marriage, finding that honesty diminished neither their past nor present bonds. "For 3 years," she said. "When nothing happened, William blamed himself, said maybe it was God's way of telling him he wasn't meant to be a father." She smiled sadly at the memory. "I always told him it would happen when the time was right. He would have been a good father," Thomas said with the generosity that never failed to touch Jane's heart. "Yes," she agreed, "and so will you." As Jane's pregnancy progressed, Thomas became even more protective, insisting on hiring a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work. Jane protested that she wasn't an invalid, but secretly appreciated his concern. Her first marriage had been full of love but short on stability. Thomas provided both in abundance. Their child, a daughter, they named Elizabeth after Thomas's mother was born on a crisp November morning with the assistance of a midwife from Cottonwood Springs. Thomas paced the yard for hours, returning to the cabin at every sound until Jane's exasperated laughter sent him back outside. When finally allowed to enter, he approached the bed where Jane cradled their newborn with an expression of such wonder that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently accepting the tiny bundle Jane offered. "She has your nose." "And your eyes, I think," Jane observed, watching as their daughter's unfocused gaze drifted toward her father's voice. "Though it's too soon to tell for certain." Thomas perched carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling Elizabeth in one arm while his free hand found Jane's. "Thank you," he said simply. Jane understood all the gratitude contained in those 2 words for their child, for their life together, for the second chance they'd both been given when neither expected it. "She needs a nickname," Jane said, stroking the downy hair on their daughter's head. "Elizabeth is a beautiful name, but quite a mouthful for such a tiny person." Thomas considered this seriously. "Eliza, Beth, Lizzie, Libby," Jane suggested. "My grandmother was Elizabeth, and that's what everyone called her." "Libby," Thomas repeated, testing the name. "Libby Graves, I like it." Their daughter yawned enormously, tiny fists waving, and both parents laughed, enchanted by every movement. "I should let you rest," Thomas said reluctantly. Jane tightened her grip on his hand. "Stay, both of you." And so they remained, the 3 of them together on the bed where once Jane had lain alone, listening to the empty silence of her cabin and wondering how she would survive. Now the room was filled with the soft sounds of their daughter's breathing and Thomas's deep voice, as he spoke to the baby about all the things he would teach her: how to ride a horse, how to recognize the constellations, how to be brave and kind and true. Jane drifted to sleep surrounded by love, secure in the knowledge that her table would never be empty again. 5 years later, Jane stood on the porch of their substantially expanded home, watching Thomas teaching 6-year-old Libby and 3-year-old William how to gentle a new foal. The ranch had grown beyond anything she'd imagined that winter day when Thomas first appeared at her door. Now they employed 3 full-time hands, ran a herd of over 100 cattle, and Jane's cheeses won prizes at county fairs across Kansas. But the true measure of their success wasn't in the healthy livestock, or the addition of a proper dairy building, or even the money in the bank that ensured their children's future. It was in the laughter that rang across the yard as Libby, fearless and sunny like her father, approached the nervous foal with a carrot, while William, more cautious but equally determined, watched from the safety of Thomas's shadow. It was in the way Thomas turned, sensing Jane's gaze, and smiled at her with the same warmth that had sustained her through 2 difficult childbirths, a devastating drought, and the normal challenges of building a life together. In that smile was everything they had become to each other: partners, lovers, parents, friends. Jane returned his smile, her hand absently touching the locket at her throat, a gift from Thomas on their 5th anniversary, containing miniature portraits of their children on one side and a small photograph of William on the other. Thomas had commissioned it specially, understanding that Jane's past was not a rival to their present, but the foundation upon which they had built their happiness. As the sun began to set over the prairie they both loved, Thomas gathered the children and headed toward the house. Libby raced ahead, always eager to be first, while William demanded to be carried, his small arms locked around his father's neck. "Mama," Libby called. "Papa says we can have apple pie if we wash up proper, did he now?" Jane raised an eyebrow at her husband. "And did Papa happen to mention who would be baking this pie?" Thomas grinned, unrepentant. "I may have implied it was already made." Jane shook her head, trying to look stern but failing. "You're fortunate I put one in the oven this morning, Thomas Graves, or you'd be explaining to these children why promises shouldn't be made without consultation." Thomas shifted William to one arm so he could wrap the other around Jane's waist. "I had faith in you," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You've never let us go hungry yet." The simple statement carried the weight of their history of that first meal shared at an empty table, of all the meals since that had nourished more than just their bodies. Jane leaned into his embrace, watching their children scramble into the house with all the energy of youth and security. "No," she agreed softly, "and I never will." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "I know." He gazed down at her, his eyes reflecting the same amazement she still felt sometimes when she considered the unexpected turns their lives had taken. "How did I get so lucky, Jane Graves?" Jane reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that 5 years had added around his eyes, lines of laughter more than hardship. "I ask myself the same question every day." As twilight deepened around them, and the scent of apple pie wafted from the open door, they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, not just the physical structure, but the life it contained. Behind them, their children's voices called impatiently for dessert. Before them stretched the ranch that had once nearly been lost, now thriving under their care. "We should go in," Jane said, though she made no move to leave the circle of Thomas's arm. "In a minute," he replied, turning to face her fully. "I just want to remember this moment." Jane understood. In the midst of daily work and child rearing, and all the mundane details of running a ranch, it was easy to forget the miracle of their finding each other. These quiet moments of recognition were precious, reminding them both of how far they had come from solitude to fullness. Thomas bent to kiss her, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing yet never lost its power to quicken Jane's pulse. When they parted, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Now we can go in," Thomas said with a smile that held promises for later, when the children were asleep. Hand in hand, they walked into the warm light of their home, closing the door on the gathering darkness. Outside, the prairie night unfurled in all its vast beauty. Inside, the table was set for 4, surrounded by voices and laughter, never to be empty again.